Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us for this Black History event. I just want to give a couple more minutes for people just to log in. For those of you who are already logged in, that's what we're waiting for, just to make sure people don't have any technical difficulties.
Okay.
All right, we're going to get started. Good afternoon and good evening, I was to say, everyone. My name is Asher Kemp. I am the Executive Director of the Coalition of Culturally Competent Providers. And I want to thank you for giving up your evening to join us and celebrating this Black History event. For those of you who don't know anything about the Coalition is a group of mental health and human service providers that were established about 6 years ago to provide, that are committed to providing and facilitating models of culturally competent practice, policies, programs for communities of color, who collectively service over 20,000 people in the city of Philadelphia. So if you'd like to find out more about the Coalition, you will see our information. I will also mention our website again at the end of tonight's event, along with our phone number. And I also like to thank our sponsor, Joe Devane from Allstate. We could not put events like this together without good support and good partnerships. I'd next like to introduce the chair of the Coalition of Culturally Competent Providers, LaJoel Harrison.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As Asher said, we are the Coalition of Culturally Competent Providers. We are made up of, excuse me, I'm on Zoom. We are made up of providers from all over the city that service. I think we are way beyond 20,000 in our reach across the city of Philadelphia. But tonight, we are excited to have our guest this evening. His name is Dr. Clark, and you may have seen his bio going across the screen, but it is such an illustrious bio that I definitely want to read it. Dr. Clark is currently a guest lecturer at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Born in Philadelphia, he is an alumnus of Cheyney University, and he earned his master's degree from Stanford University and a doctoral degree from Harvard Graduate School. Very impressive resume. He's a former teaching fellow at Harvard and served as the director of Harvard Graduate School of Education Field Placement Office. Dr. Clark has devoted his 30-year professional career to the development of historically Black colleges and universities. His previous appointments include VP of Development and Director of $200 million campaign for Hampton University, Vice President for Development at Morehouse College, Vice President for University Advancement at Fisk University and Tuskegee University, Vice President for Development at Lincoln University, and Vice Chancellor for Institutional Advancement at North Carolina Central University. Quite impressive. He is the author of The Friends of Freedom, A Battle for Heart and Soul of America, and The Windfall, a heartwarming transformational story. Welcome, Dr. Clark.
Welcome, thank you. It's good to be here.
You can tell us about what we will be engaging in this evening and what you have to offer us.
Okay, well, I think we're going to start with a video trailer that gives you an idea of the content of the book and its relevance to what's going on in the world today. So Renee, with your permission, I'd like to run that. Thank you, Renee. So here's what I was thinking. I'd like to, with your indulgence, walk you through a PowerPoint presentation that should go pretty quickly. It's, I'm going to guess, about 20 minutes. And then I kind of wanted to pose some questions to you all and solicit some questions as well. So why don't we get started? Renee's going to navigate. Are we in place?
One moment, just getting there. You're ready.
Okay. So we'll start with slide 1. Okay, good evening, everyone. Let's go straight to slide 2. Next slide, please. I want to start off by sharing with you an observation that James Baldwin made years ago, one that I really resonate with and really explains, at least to my satisfaction, why history is so important and why it has such wide and deep influences, consciously and subconsciously. Let me read it if I could. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are consciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. Next slide, please. I want to take a minute to talk about my book, The Friends of Freedom, which hopefully you all will get a chance to read. But I take the position that my reason for writing and how I came to write it is just as important as the book itself. And I'll be as brief as possible. Some of you may know this backstory. But somewhere around 1980, I was invited back to my alma mater, Cheyney, to index and catalog a rare set of archival materials that have since been known as the William Dorsey Collection. So as the story goes, these materials were in a janitor's closet in Biddle Hall, which was an old administration building that was being retrofitted and renovated. So everything in the building literally had to go. So they parked a large dumpster next to the building and they were throwing everything and anything into this dumpster, including miscellaneous trash, broken desks, chairs, and the like. And it turns out that in the janitor's closet, there were these materials that looked very old. They were decomposing and they were moldy. And not naturally, you would want to throw them in the trash. But a curious janitor opened up the closet and he saw what amounted to about 370 scrapbooks, photographs, manuscripts, and the like. And he opened up one of the scrapbooks and lo and behold, what do you think is inside them? Well, it's newspaper clippings from a period long ago, roughly 1860 to 1910. And it turns out they were the life's work of one man, William H. Dorsey, who would dutifully cut out of the local newspapers anything and everything having to do with Black folks. So he was a self-appointed chronicler of Black history, if you will. Next slide. So come to find out, William Dorsey was a member of an organization called the American Negro Historical Society. These were learned men, largely self-educated, who were bibliophiles. They were collectors, lovers of books, and self-appointed chroniclers of history. And there you see a picture of William H. Dorsey. So the janitor reports to the vice president at Cheyney that he doesn't think we ought to be throwing this stuff away. And the vice president came down, his name was Herbert Womack, and he looked at it and he says, oh my God, this stuff is precious. And he was right about that because the clippings in these scrapbooks are from newspapers that are irreplaceable. They're essentially defunct and out of print. And these scrapbooks give us a window into the world of Black folks living in and around Philadelphia at the time. So Dorsey and his colleagues formed this organization, the American Negro Historical Society, in 1897. Next slide. Now, there's something interesting about these men, older men, accomplished men, and they shared some common characteristics. They were born free. They considered themselves free persons of color. They were born free somewhere around the early 1800s. Some of them were never slaves and had ancestral roots that predated the Civil War. That is, they had roots that predated America before it became America. They were tax-paying and law-abiding citizens. They were previously enslaved fugitives who escaped north to freedom, or either they purchased, if we can put that in quote, purchased their freedom, like people like Reverend Richard Allen did. Next slide. So these men, these American Negro Historical Society, were what we would call eyewitnesses to history. Those eyes had seen a lot of stuff. They witnessed a wide acceptance of slavery as an immutable fact of life. Imagine that, when slavery was as natural as breathing. They were free people of color who witnessed the steady growth of slavery as an economic engine for national growth. They saw slavery emerge as the most important moral and social issue of their period. That is the question of whether it was right, acceptable to perpetually enslave over 4 million men, women, and children. And when I say perpetual, of course, I mean till the end of time. These free persons witnessed and participated with great pride in the bloody and costly Civil War. They witnessed the brief period of Reconstruction after the war, and they lived long enough to see decades of Jim Crow segregation follow the Civil War and Reconstruction. Next slide, please. So when we talk about purchasing, it's a strange concept to get across, particularly the young students, high school and up, because there was such a taken for granted, if you will, assumed justification for slavery. So back then, when these guys grew up, slavery was thoroughly entrenched in the American psyche and the social order, again, as an immutable fact of life. And it was sold and accepted this way. It was argued that it was an economic necessity. Second, it was legalized and approved and sanctioned and safeguarded by the US Constitution itself in Article 4. Some even argue that it was ordained by God. Others argue that it was reflective of the quote natural order. And again, always an immutable fact of life. Too bad, so sad that Black folks had to be enslaved. On this slide at the bottom, I have a quote from a congressman from Pennsylvania. Never ceases to amaze me. When he was asked about slavery, he said, and I quote, "Slavery is a fact. We are not responsible for it. The people of the South are not responsible for it. It was brought here before the Union was born." Listen to the language. "A mysterious providence has cast upon this continent two races, distinct in origin, character, and color." So again, this is a bit of an absurd statement, but he's saying essentially, we didn't create it. We didn't cause it. We didn't will it into being. It just happened. And this thing called mysterious providence made it so and brought it our way. Next slide. Now, I don't want to belabor this point, but I think it bears mention because it's very personal for me. Some of you all, I trust, are old enough to remember the miniseries Roots, television miniseries. Well, it first aired in January 1977. And Asher, yes, I was around then. I was graduating from Cheyney that particular year. And this is a scene that you all may be familiar with. Are you all familiar with it? Most of you? Okay. There's a picture of Toby being whipped in Roots. And to the right of it, I have a poster for an exhibit that perhaps some of you saw. It ran for a while in New York. And it was museum exhibit about slavery in New York that dates back to the 1700s when the Dutch brought slaves from Africa. Now, what's similar to these two things, even though they're 28 years apart, was the betrayal of slavery. And by that, I mean, there was this notion that slavery existed, but there was no indignation or outrage or moral embarrassment about it all. It was just, it happened, particularly in the exhibit in New York that I attended. I went up to North just to see this exhibit. And there you found descriptions of slavery, the draconian laws, punishments, torture, instruments of torture. And they were talked about as if it was perfectly natural. Again, no moral indignation. So, you know, if you're like me, you saw Roots once, you saw this exhibit once, and you're angry, you're upset. And if you want to be in a more private moment, you even talked about hatred. Like, how could one group of people treat another group of people like that? So I always had a problem with slavery, because once I saw Roots, once I saw this exhibit in New York, I got it. But the question comes up, well, okay, what do I do with this information? What do I do with all this indignation and anger? So I've always had a personal experience, and I don't think I'm alone on this. Next slide. Come to find out, I was not alone about this. I have a quote here at the top from an abolitionist dating back to around 1833. And listen to what he says. He says, the portrait of the Negro has seldom been drawn but by the pencil of the oppressor of the Negro. And the Negro has sat for that portrait in the distorted attitude of slavery. The quote at the bottom comes from the distinguished historian John Hope Franklin. And he puts it this way, as a question: is it possible, just maybe, historians find the study of slavery more exotic and more tragic, and therefore more attractive than the latter period of freedom? Meaning that we would rather study Black folks as slaves as opposed to what they did afterwards in the years of freedom. Next slide, please. So, why did these American Negro Historical Society gentlemen do what they did? Well, they explained to us why they did this collection. They had a reverence for life and a reverence for learning, and they wanted to pass this history on to future generations. The president of the organization put it this way: we want the newspapers, the churches, and the parents to tell their children what our past condition was, and about those dear people who are dead and gone, of the sacrifices they made on our behalf, and the grand opportunities we are now offered. That's from Robert Adger, the president. The second quote at the bottom is from William Still, who was also a member of the American Negro Historical Society. He put it this way: the heroism and desperate struggle that many of our people had to endure under the terrible oppression that they were under should be kept green in the memory of this and coming generations. Kept green in the memory. Next slide, please. So what is it that these gentlemen passed down to us? I would say that what they passed down had nothing to do necessarily with the intergenerational transfer of knowledge or mere facts. What they gave us essentially was three gifts. One, the gift of cultural identity, helping us understand, helping the individual understand who I am. The gift of racial pride, who we are, and the gift of resilience and resistance in a racially oppressive society. Next slide, please. So, what emerges from their collections, these materials, and they're voluminous, are two different lenses, two ways of looking at slavery. One as tragedy, one as agency. In tragedy, we portray slaves as powerless, passive, and pitiable victims of slavery, and where we, of course, we have internalized oppression. To the right, we have agency, and this is what John Hope Franklin was saying. Why aren't we studying free persons of color as acting in the role of informed citizen activists? Because he always wanted to remember us to remember that our ancestors were enslaved. They were not slave, and there is a difference. Next slide. So these gentlemen, these free persons of color, didn't have it easy in Philadelphia, despite our label as the city of brotherly love. Starting in 1837, they were stripped of the right to vote through chicanery. They were subject to mobocracy and did not enjoy the protection of the police. There were periodic race riots throughout the 30s and the 40s. And there was widespread destruction of Black businesses, churches, and orphanages in our fair city. The quote at the bottom comes from Robert Purvis, a longtime resident of Philadelphia, during one of those race riots when things just went totally berserk. Here he is writing to his girlfriend about what's going on in the streets of Philadelphia. Listen to his language. I know not where I should begin, nor how I can describe the wantonness, brutality, and murderous spirits of those who aligned against us, nor of the apathy and inhumanity of the whole community in the matter. The press, the church, the magistrate, clergymen, and devils are against us. The measure of our suffering is full. I am convinced of our utter nothingness in the public's estimation. Here and there, the image and bright countenance of your smiling face strengthens me, save that there is for me nothing redeeming. That's pretty powerful stuff, right? Next slide, please. Things really hit a turning point, if you will, with the burning of Pennsylvania Hall in 1837. On the right, you see this majestic building that was set up as a center for the abolitionist movement in Philadelphia. And within a week's time, after its first convention, it was totally engulfed in flames. So it was a major polarizing event for the pro-slavery and abolitionist forces in Philadelphia. Next slide. Frederick Douglass was a frequent visitor to the city and very popular on the lecture circuit. He had this to say about free people of color and the city in general and its attitude toward Black folks. Here he says, there is not perhaps anywhere to be found a city in which color is more rampant than in Philadelphia. Who knew, right? Since all the incidents of caste are to be seen there in perfection, the colored man is compelled to occupy only that which are called the servile positions in life. And yet, despite the restrictions laid upon them and the discrimination to bind them into one common bundle of degradation, we could name many comparatively rich men among them. Next slide, please. So if we look at Philadelphia in the 20s, 30s, 40s, it experiences urbanization, the process of urbanization and large-scale immigration of Europeans into the city, namely the Irish, the Italians, the Germans, the Swedes, et cetera, et cetera. And all those European folks brought different animosities that they carried with them from the continent, but they were united on one thing, and that was Negrophobia. And by that I'm describing, this is the term that they use, the fear, dislike, and ridicule of Black people. Protestants hated the Catholics, hated the Jews, but one thing they could agree on is that Black people were not worthy of citizenship in the city. Again, despite the fact that these Black folks had been in the city, they and their ancestors, long before the waves of European immigration occurred. So here we see examples of the type of demeaning cartoons that were found in the newspapers and magazines and gazettes throughout Philadelphia. On your right, I don't know if you can see this, there's a gentleman in sort of clownish attire, and he says, "How you find yourself this weather, Miss Chloe?" And she says, "Pretty much by thank you, Mr. Caesar, but only I aspire too much." Okay, so you get the idea. We're ridiculing Black folks as being imitators and not very good ones of white culture. And there's a certain buffoonish quality about them. Next slide, please. Free men of color, free men and women of color obviously gravitated to the abolitionist cause. And here we see an article in Life in Philadelphia cartoon series, where we have, as they say under the title of the photo of the drawing, the grand celebration of the abolition of African slavery. And if you look closely, you see that these men are just simply having a good time, carousing. The man on the far right is being carried out. He's in a drunken stupor. So these are not people to be taken seriously. They're buffoons, they're drunkards. They're really not about anything. Okay, next slide, please. So eventually Philadelphia becomes the center of the nationwide abolitionist movement and a major hub of the Underground Railroad. And this was something that I really did not understand growing up in Philadelphia. When as it relates to Philadelphia history, we learned about the Revolutionary War and the birthing of American democracy at Independence Hall, et cetera, but we never talked about what happened after the Revolutionary War. Well, Philadelphia was a major player in this national movement. And of course, it was the major city, the largest city and closest city to the Mason-Dixie line that separated the southern states, which you see in blue, and the northern states, which you see in olive. So let me ask you a question. When Black History comes around annually, who's one of the first people that we think about? Anybody?
Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman, that's right. Next slide, please. So instinctively, we think about Harriet Tubman because, and for good reason, because arguably she was perhaps the most daring and most sacrificial and most bravest one of the bunch of the Underground Railroad operatives, male or female. William Still had this to say about her. He said, she seemed wholly devoid of personal fear. The idea of being captured by slave hunters and slave holders seemed never to enter her mind. He says her life, it is probable, was never known before or since. That's pretty high praise, right? Next slide, please. The thing that I want to emphasize, and I emphasize a lot, particularly when I talk to high school students, because it seems apparent, but then again, it's not. So I apologize if it seems like I'm stating the obvious. But obviously, Harriet Tubman did not act alone. The Underground Railroad was a collective endeavor, and it was run by fugitive slaves and free persons of color who were the backbone of the railroad, serving as guides, station masters, lookouts who operated various stations and safe houses. Harriet Tubman went back and forth over the Mason-Dixie line, but she needed a network of people to help us progress as she moved various people, sometimes large groups of people, sometimes just a few, across the Mason-Dixie line. And free persons of color of varying classes opened up their hearts and their homes and made consistent contributions of time, talent, and treasure to the Underground Railroad. Because obviously, once in Philadelphia, fugitive slaves needed logistical support. They came here penniless, malnourished, a lot of them, and they needed food, clothes, money, and transportation to continue their northbound journey. Next slide, please. The other thing I'd like to emphasize about the Underground Railroad, that it was maintained by interfaith and a multiracial logistical collaborations. There you see pictures of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, and you see there a collection of white and Black men as well. Next slide, please. Now, I trust most of you have heard of Henry Box Brown. Henry Box Brown has made his way into the history books at long last. He's a gentleman who was a fugitive slave who was boxed up, or crated, I should say, in Richmond, Virginia, and shipped to Philadelphia in this crate in the dark with a hand drill for extra air if he needed it. It was an arduous journey, made even more difficult by the fact that the train that he was on made sharp turn, and he turned out upside down most of the trip. If you can picture that, upside down, wrong side up. So as he tells the story, and you can find his story, his book on the internet, he talks about in detail his decision to run the risk of putting himself in the crate, He made a prayer to God. He said he cannot bear his existence. So either he was going to be free or he was going to die alone in that box. The thing I want you to realize about this box, this picture is it's a little bit misleading. When they finally opened up the box, when he arrived in Philadelphia, they say he was so wet, it was as if he swam up the Delaware River. He was weak. His eyes were bulging out. His heart was failing him. I mean, it was quite an ordeal, but he made it through. So I asked the question of students a lot, well, who put Henry Box Brown in the crate? Obviously, he didn't pack up himself. And the answer is one gentleman by the name of Samuel A. Smith, who was a white guy, okay? And what happens is that Samuel A. Smith turns around and helps other slaves doing the same thing, crating them up and sending them to Philadelphia, and he got caught. And the state of Virginia, where he lived, obviously, that was a no-no. So he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He was put in a cell, heavily chained, a cell that measured 4 by 6 feet. Imagine that, if you will. He was detested so much, they wanted to make an example out of him, and they even hired one of the prisoners to stab him several times. But he survived the ordeal, and he moved north. So I like to tell students, think about this for a minute. Henry Box Brown was a slave. He had everything to gain and nothing to lose, so he took his chances in the box. Stephen A. Smith had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And he did almost lose everything, his life, namely. But yet and still, he deplored slavery so much that he was willing to incur that risk. So if we're going to tell the story of the Underground Railroad, we have to talk about people who gave life, white folks and Black folks who risked life and limb to support the fugitive slaves. And hopefully Samuel Smith will one day be remembered as much as Henry Box Brown. Next slide, please. So the other thing I like to talk about with the students is that during the period 1850 to 1860, 1860 being the outbreak of the Civil War, during this 10-year period, the Underground Railroad was a criminal enterprise. And what do I mean by that? So in 1850, with the support of President Millard Fillmore and the US Congress, the United States Congress, they passed this bill called the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that anybody caught assisting slaves to escape will be subject to fines, imprisonment, and kidnapping. They even specified that for every slave that you help along their way to freedom, you would be fined $1,000 and/or imprisonment. Well, $1,000, y'all, is a lot of money today. Imagine what $1,000 was in 1850. That meant if you're caught, you are going to jail unless you can magically produce that kind of money. So the fugitive slave was a real game changer. It was a gut check, because prior to 1850, if you helped a runaway slave, that was your business. It was a matter of moral consciousness, right? But now afterwards, what are you going to do when threatened with life, when your own liberty is being threatened? So some people stood up, some people bowed out. But again, the fugitive slave law was a real game changer. And I have a quote here by, well, he's not the first to denounce this, but Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of my favorite writers, said it was the most detestable law ever enacted by a civilized society. Because think about it, what they had done essentially through this federal law was to criminalize acts of charity. It was madness. Next slide, please. So I'm drawing to a close. I talk a lot about the white station masters along the Underground Railroad. On the left, we have Reverend Levi Coffin, who sort of was the main man in the Midwest, operating out of Cincinnati. And on the right, one of my favorites is Thomas Garrett. I don't know if you all know that name. You know, in Wilmington, there's a Thomas Garrett, Harriet Tubman Park, named after those two people. So what happens with Garrett, and why do I like him so much? So in 1848, he's put on trial. What is he on trial for? For assisting slaves escape. He's in Wilmington, Delaware, and Delaware, of course, is a slave state. So they brought him into court and they fined him and they literally bankrupted him. He was a wealthy man, okay? And by the time he finished paying all the fines for all the slaves that he had helped, admittedly helped, after the trial, he gave a sort of mini lecture in the courtroom. And he says, and this is the quote that I like the most, he says, "Friend, I haven't a dollar in the world, but if thee knows a fugitive who needs a breakfast, send him to me." That's kind of gangster, right? Okay, next slide, please. So as I finished the process of indexing and cataloging this Dorsey collection, it was clear to me that I wanted to do something to try to keep faith with what the American Negro Historic Society was trying to do. I had all this disparate information and I wanted to share it, particularly with young people, because I had learned so much from doing this research about people I had never heard of in my life. And I'm speaking as someone who was born and raised and went to college in Philadelphia. So I'm anxious. I have a kind of religious fervor about sharing this information. And I knew students wouldn't be coming out to Cheyney to be looking at scrapbooks that we ultimately put on microfilm. You all old enough to remember microfilm machines with the crank and all that? So how do we pass on this information? So I came up with the idea of writing a book, a fact-based book, using the power of story and the efficacy of historical fictions. So I wanted to tell a story. Next slide. Like all good stories, you need a hero, and then the hero needs to be, or preferably should be, on some sort of notable quest, if you will. And for me, I had to look no further than Octavius Catto. Catto, you all, of course, know, was a well-regarded and beloved educator and activist who was brutally murdered on the streets of Philadelphia in broad daylight. So in the Dorsey scrapbooks, there were two, scrapbooks 76 and 77, as I recall, that were devoted to the trial of Frank Kelly. Frank Kelly was the white Irish gentleman who was accused and actually admitted to killing Cato, but was later acquitted and never was brought to justice. So I read about this trial of Frank Kelly, and then that's how I learned about Octavius Catto. When I was growing up in West Philly, we called it the Cato School. It was at 42nd and Ludlow. And all we knew was that it was a school for delinquent boys. And we were told that we had to put our lunch money in our shoes because they would shake us down and take our money. That's all I knew about Cato. So of course, since that time and today, Cato has grown in popularity, and I trust that most young school kids in Philadelphia and beyond are learning the name and the significance of his life and his legacy. And all that, of course, eventuated in the dedication of a statue in his honor at City Hall in 2017. Next slide. So I think I'd like to conclude there. I think we're at the end of my 20-minute rant, if you will. But I'd like for you all to consider some questions that I like to pose to parents, teachers, and now you all as culturally competent caregivers. And starting at the top, let me read it if I could. What did the American Negro Society believe? Why did they believe it was important to pass down history and share their lived experiences with future generations, particularly children? Renee, if we go back to slide 10, you'll see that they asked and answered their own question. Yeah, there we go. They wanted to reach children, future generations. They wanted to give them what I was calling these three gifts. And that's what I want us to remember, that it is a gift, and we would do well to share this history with our children. Back again, if you would, to the slide before. points to ponder. Yeah. Second point to ponder. What are some of the psychological and educational disadvantages of interpreting African American history exclusively through the lenses of passive victims? If you want to understand slavery and the horrors and the cruelty of slavery, I mean, of course, that's your prerogative, but why wouldn't you also give due emphasis to the works, the deeds, the sacrifices, this triumph of free people of color who were oppressed by that same society and managed to thrive, survive and thrive in it? Point number 3, Negrophobia is clearly in evidence today and has given rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. What constructive measures can we take to mitigate its corrosive and polarizing effects? And then finally, our cultural identity and factual history clearly manifest psychological and spiritual qualities of undaunted faith, agency, courage, and resilience in the face of racial oppression. How can we more intentionally uphold and integrate these qualities into our pedagogical and treatment practices to better serve 21st century learning communities? Next slide. Again, just points to ponder. With the time remaining, I just thought we would have a sort of dialogue, and I'd be prepared to answer any questions you all might have, or welcome any comments you might have about anything that I've said.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. That was a very powerful presentation.
Thank you.
And before we go into Q&A, I just want to remind everyone that this is a recorded session, so that for when we don't have people when people aren't able to make it to our live sessions, we're able to play it over for them, upload it to our YouTube channel, and people can view it later. So certainly, if you do not want to be part of the recorded session, then you should not participate at this point. If you raise your hand, Renee can give you the ability to speak your question instead of having to chat it in the chat box or place it in the Q&A box. So if you use that feature, the raise your hand feature, you can actually ask a question directly. And so as our viewers are getting themselves together, I just have a few questions for you, Dr. Clark.
Sure.
So when you were writing your book, who was your target audience? Who were you imagining would read this?
You know, as I was thinking about it, I said to myself, I would like to write a book that I had wished would have been around when I was in high school and college. So I imagine myself to be writing a book for high school audiences and college students. That was my target. And then I would say beyond that, general reading audiences right behind that.
That's a very specific time period when we're all trying to figure out who we are, what type of adult we will be, who we will become. So
and something else I said to myself, sort of my pedagogical intent. I wanted students to read the book and understand it and interpret it in a way that allowed them to see their educational pursuits in the broader context of our ongoing struggle for social justice. That was my not so hidden agenda.
that was my next question.
Okay.
What did you look to inspire from your readers?
Yeah, I wanted to inform as well as inspire, because I have to tell you, I don't know if I made the point strong enough. I am uncomfortable with this notion of just telling history as a collection of facts that doesn't have any bearing on contemporary events. As Ball was saying, history affects everything that we do at both a conscious and subconscious level.
Renee, do you see any hands raised? I can't tell from this.
We just have one. I'm going to let Jim Page in to talk.
Okay, great.
Hi, Jim, you're on.
Yeah, well, Dr. Clark, I would just like to thank you for really stressing the fact that our history is much more than being oppressed. In fact, when you really look across the historical landscape, the work of African Americans is really the foundation of this country.
Absolutely.
And the fact that we don't talk about that gives sort of the illusion. And I think even this COVID-19 has really demonstrated that, where the emphasis is on the sort of Black, brown, depressed group, when in fact, as you pointed out, given opportunity, we have always excelled.
Sure.
So the only thing that's blocking us is the lack of opportunity. So I just want to thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that I neglected to mention in my presentation is that there is a whole new body of research publications coming out that not only talk about slavery then in the moment when it was practiced and accepted as an immutable fact of life, but current scholarship, ongoing scholarship, is showing how slavery made possible higher ed institutions like Harvard, Brown, and Princeton, meaning that people built vast fortunes off slavery to accumulate wealth. And only half of that story has been told, and it's starting to come out now.
We have a question in the Q&A section. I'll read it. I'm interested in current students' ideas about cultural history. What has been the students' response to learning this information?
Well, I'm no longer lecturing, just occasionally, but I'm basically confining most of my lecturing to college students. But I can tell you, high school students really gravitated to the book and what I was saying. It seemed to be offering the kind of missing link that I think I was looking for when I was their age. And when you write history in a way that makes it come to life, and you try to stand in the spiritual space of our ancestors, to try to think the way they think, see what they saw, and react the way they did, it's a very powerful reading experience for young people. There's a reading specialist, Alfred Tatum, who talks about this notion of enabling text. And he says that junior high school students need more enabling text. And by that, he means text that helps students understand their place in the world. And I was hoping that my book, The Friends of Freedom, would be just that. On the college level, it's a lot different. And it's a bit more challenging because, believe it or not, a lot of the guys like that we teach here at Morehouse didn't know this. They were like me. And I don't mind, admitting that to you. So it's almost embarrassing how little I knew about a history of people and a city that I grew up in. So it's something of an awakening, if you will. And, since I wrote the book, there are various schools that have used it as their freshman studies program to sort of get them off to a good start with their relationship to books and to learning and Black history. So I'm happy as can be about that.
Thank you. I would like at this point, before we close out, we have some amazing clinicians here viewing, and invite either any of the psychologists or psychiatrists into this space to discuss what it means to receive your history in a negative way and what that does to your mental health, and how powerful it can be for someone to give you a positive outlook on your history. So if Dr. Banks, Dr. Williams, Jim Page, anybody want to chime in? Here we go.
You got Dr. S.
I can't say, oh, Dr. Schwenka.
Hello. Hello.
Go ahead, Dr. Banks.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Clark. I was transfixed as you spoke, listening, and I actually just closed my eyes for the whole presentation, and I was just imagining everything. Time I would open my eyes and look up and see your slides, but I just think that when we look back at history and we invoke ourselves in the stories of our heroes and sheroes.
Mm-hmm.
It takes us from our present day struggle, and it allows us to listen to individuals who triumphed with very little resources.
Yes.
Most of their resources came from within.
Yes.
And the power to reclaim your humanity and willfully risk life towards some destiny, I find therapeutically just that is the definition of one's miracle.
Yeah.
To take yourself back to some historical story, to move yourself forward. And so clinically, I think bibliotherapy for us as a people is a very valuable tool that we could use to heal ourselves in today's chaotic world and environment. What are your thoughts?
I thoroughly agree with that. And I've witnessed that. I've witnessed it with students that have said to me privately that the book has changed their life. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. What I had hoped to do with a lot of these students is put them on a path of lifelong learning. Just give them enough to whet their appetite so that they would, take this into their hearts, if you will, and reap the therapeutic benefits of it. I mean, I'm not a trained clinician by any stretch of the imagination, but I can tell you that many students have said that. And that's what, let's just put it this way, that's what books do. Good books, anyway. They can literally transform lives. And that's why I'm so anxious to get it in as many hands as possible. So that's my new thing now, promoting this book and the history that undergirds it.
Thank you.
I hope you all will get a chance to read it. It is available now as an ebook on Apple iBooks.
Dr. Clark, I just want to say thank you on behalf of the coalition, the members, and the city of Philadelphia, and how you brought this history together. I also have to give a plug. Thank you for the Cheyney. I am a Cheyney alumni, so I do appreciate that, undergrad. And as I was listening to you, many of people on this Zoom platform, and transition myself back to when I was in high school, the thing that I really heard about and really said to me is about unity and how unified people of color were in those days, because they really had to for their survival. And if there's some way that we can build off on that to come up with an agenda to unify some of our things and understand that our brother is not our enemy, I think we would be such in a better place. So it has motivated me in looking at a number of different ways of how we do that and how we bring people together. The other thing I would like to say, you're absolutely right in terms of the things that happened then are still happening today. That's why we have Black Lives Matter, the social injustice. And one of the things that also stood out to me that I think of us in terms of the coalition, when you talked about informed citizens of activism, I think about that's what we do in terms of our arena as it relates to mental health and advocating for policies, resources, and things around that nature. So again, I thank you. You took us to church in a lot of ways. I'm sitting here taking notes, and I saw some of our other individuals taking notes. So I'd like to invite you back when we can do a book signing and this pandemic is over, so we can meet you in person and have some more dialogue. So again, thank you very much. For our viewers, we have a survey. Your feedback is always welcome, that you will get in an email form. And also, if you'd like to find out more about the coalition, Renee will pull up the screen that has our information, our contact and website. So again, thank you again for joining us this evening. And also we have part 2 of our event for Black History. Mrs. Jordan, who is one of our other authors, will be presenting on Thursday. And she is such an amazing young lady. I don't want to give too much away. But for this young lady to put this together at the age of 24, her book and how she came to put it together, I know that's not what I was doing when I was 24. So I'm extremely impressed. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. And
Thank
thanking
you
our
all.
sponsor, Joe Devane of Allstate.
Thank you all. Take care now.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.